Okay, hello and welcome to the 29th presentation in the Virtual History series presented by the Baltimore Architecture Foundation and Baltimore Heritage. This is Nathan Denny's, the Associate Director of the Baltimore Architecture Foundation. First, a big thank you to everyone who donated to be with us. Through your support, we've been able to host these programs for free nearly every week since April. We encourage you to make a donation so we can continue delivering virtual programs into 2021. First, a few announcements. I hope you for a presentation on the Olmsteds and how they shape Baltimore's park system that I'm personally very thankful to have this year. Also next week, we'll have a presentation in honor of the Year of the Woman on an architect who had a great role in designing some buildings in Baltimore in the mid-20th century, including one of the television stations, and more to come on that. Also next week, we have the BAF is hosting a gingerbread design competition. So if you're around on December 10th, tune in for that. It's going to be a lot of fun. We have categories like Baltimore Landmarks, Innovation, and the ugliest gingerbread house. We'll also have a holiday themed cocktail making demonstration. And now today's presentation. At this point, she needs no introduction. Meg Fielding has already taken us on several fascinating architecture journeys across Maryland, and I'm so pleased to have her back to share the history of Baltimore's hospitals through its architecture, compiled through research she is doing in her role at MedChi. I should also add that Meg is a past president of the Baltimore Architecture Foundation, and I encourage you to follow her Instagram handle, Pigtown Design, to follow her architectural adventures. If you have questions for Meg, please add them to the chat box and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the presentation. With that, take it away, Meg.
Thanks, Nathan. As Nathan said, I'm Meg Fielding. I'm the head of history of medicine in Maryland at MedChi, and we'll talk about that in a minute. While we tend to think there are about 6 hospitals in Baltimore, there were at least 60 that I counted when I was doing a family tree of hospitals dating from the 1700s. And while hospitals these days are mostly generalists, hospitals during the 1800s dealt with incredibly specific disorders, as we will see. Due to time constraints, I whittled down my list to about 20, which we will visit in chronological order. And I've bundled some similar hospitals together. For example, there were at least 5 eye, ear, and throat hospitals, and a similar number of maternity hospitals. One brief note, I will talk a lot about dispensaries, which were mainly outpatient clinics for the poor. A wide range of people, including pregnant women, children, incurables, those with contagious diseases, were often excluded from inpatient hospital services. So this was the reason for the dispensary movement. There are at least 34 dispensaries in the city, including the first and the second, the north, the west, the east, and the south dispensaries, ones for nervous disorders, ears, noses, and throats, women and children, Hebrews and Protestants, and even a homeopathic dispensary. I've illustrated this lecture with both historic and contemporary photographs, engravings, and paintings from MedChi's collection of historic portraits. And at the end, I'll share my sources with you. And if you have questions, please type them into the chat box and we'll have a Q&A section when I finish the slides. So share screen. Can I share my screen now, Nathan?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So interestingly, when I was getting ready for this, I came across an old graphic from one of our books that had 7 of the historic hospitals and medical colleges in Maryland, so in Baltimore. So we'll talk about some of these as we move through. So we're starting out at the Baltimore Almshouse, and it was founded in 1773 and located a half a mile west of what was then the city line. However, the expansion of the city resulted in a number of relocations over the years. In 1820, the almshouse moved to the Calverton Mansion, which will also become another asylum later on. And they stayed there until 1866, when it made its final move to its present location on the east side of the city. The name was changed to Bayview Asylum because of the close proximity to the Chesapeake. In the mid 1880s, William Walsh, who was one of the big four at Hopkins, began seeing patients at Bayview as part of his research. And that created the first connection between the asylum and Johns Hopkins. The transition to the hospital began in 1925 when Bayview became a chronic and acute care hospital and was renamed Baltimore City Hospitals. And I think a lot of people might remember that. And in 1984, the city of Baltimore transferred ownership of the Baltimore City Hospitals to Johns Hopkins, which renamed it Francis Scott Key Medical Center. And in 1994, the name changed to Johns Hopkins Bayview to convey its connection with Johns Hopkins. And this is Samuel Stringer Cole, who's one of the men in our painting collection. And he and William Hazlitt Clendon, and also in our collection, were both early physicians at Bayview. And William Clendon is actually a Rembrandt Peale painting. Hang on. This is the Baltimore Orphan Asylum. It was begun in 1798 as the Female Humane Associated Charity School by a group of women who banded together to assist widows and their children suffering in the aftermath of the American Revolution. Over the years, it merged with a number of other organizations, including the Female Orphaline Charity School, and I've always wondered what an orphaline is, the Baltimore Female Orphan Asylum, the Home of the Friendless, and finally the Baltimore Orphan Asylum. And this is the Home of the Friendless at its peak, and this is sadly it today. It moved around the city from Calvert to Mulberry to Stricker Streets, and then finally to Druid Hill Avenue, which is where it is now. This building is now. Children were given an elementary education, and girls were taught cooking, sewing, laundry, and housework so as to find suitable positions as servants. And boys were taught a trade. And in 1926, the Abel family donated their property on Woodbourne Avenue, known as Marble Hall. And that's this building here. The house was formerly known as Tivoli and had been the summer home of Enoch Pratt. Today, the name of the organization was, in 1965, the organization was changed to Woodbourne, and that's what it is today. And it's a psychiatric facility for boys. And because we are generally connected with the medical field, I've added MedChi, where I work, in there, and it's the Medical and Chirurgical Faculty of Maryland. And we were founded in 1799 to prevent quackery and pretenders to the medical arts. 100 founders, 4 from each county in Maryland, petitioned the legislature to establish an organization which would set standards for medical practitioners in Maryland. The name derives from medicine, which is the scientific aspect of the profession, and chirurgery, which is the old Latin word for surgery. The faculty aspect comes in 1807 when members established what is now the University of Maryland School of Medicine. For the next 180 years, the organization was known as the faculty, and it is now known as MedChi, the Maryland State Medical Society, and it's the professional association for physicians in Maryland. And we frequently have people call and say, is this MedChi? And we tell them, no, it's MedChi. So just sort of going around, this is Upton Scott, and he was the first president of the faculty. And he is actually the uncle of Francis Scott Key, who wrote the national anthem. This is John Archer. And when we look at him, we always think, was he really that scary looking, or is it just a bad painter? He was the first person to receive a medical diploma in the United States, basically by virtue of his name, Archer. John Crawford developed the first vaccines in America. And Marcia Crocker Noyes was the librarian who lived and worked here at the faculty for 50 years. And she actually had an apartment, which you cannot see, that was on the top floor of our building, which we built in 1909. And as I said, she lived and worked here for 50 years, and she's still here, but that's a whole nother lecture. Baltimore has always been a port city, and from the beginning, one thing that the city wanted to do was prevent diseases from ships coming in to infect the citizens. So there were a number of quarantine and public health hospitals, Hawkins Point, Lazaretto Point, and the Marine Hospital. Checkpoints were established at Hawkins Point, which is close to where the Key Bridge is, and Lazaretto Point, which is across from Fort McHenry. So ships could stop and the crews could be given a clean bill of health. Anyone who was deemed unhealthy was sent to the Quarantine and Pest Hospital of the Port of Baltimore. The Marine Hospital was for sailors on American registered ships who became sick or were injured in the line of duty. And that's this building here. They initially applied at the Customs House downtown and then were moved to the hospital at Wyman Park. Dr. Francis Donaldson, who was one of our members and one of our portraits, was the only physician at the Marine Hospital who escaped an epidemic of typhus, which swept the hospital in 1848. The Marine Hospital later became a U.S. public health hospital, and it's now part of the Johns Hopkins campus. As I mentioned, there were a number of dispensaries here in Baltimore, and over the years, there were a number, and Baltimore General Dispensary was the first to open. Dispensaries provided medical and health care to the poor, and this one was founded by Dr. James Crawford, who I just showed you, who was also the founder and the most active member of the Maryland Society for Promoting Useful Information, and that's something I would love to join. Many other members of the faculty were also associated with the Baltimore General Dispensary over the decades, including Ashton Alexander, whose family gave the name to Alexandria, Virginia. The funds to support the dispensary, this dispensary, came from the state lottery, concerts, and fines imposed on persons keeping houses of ill fame. In 1959, a decision was made to sell the dispensary building, which is actually right across from Lexington Market, and establish a foundation which would grant money to the city's hospitals for the free distribution of medicine at outpatient clinics. And I don't know whether you saw the sign here, but they're advertising our lecture 100 years in the future. So that was kind of cool. This is the College of Medicine in Maryland. You may recognize some of the buildings. In 1807, the legislature passed a bill creating this college, but this never would have happened without the members of the faculty, hence the reason our name, the Medical and Chirurgical Faculty of Maryland, including Dr. John B. Davidge. In the Annals of Medicine, which was published on our centenary, the founding of this college, the forerunner of the University of Maryland, emanated from and owes its existence directly to the medical and chirurgical faculty. However, it was almost over before it started. Dr. Davidge owned a building on Liberty Street where he began instructing students. He procured a subject and began anatomy classes. Prejudice against dissection was great, and the public was bent on destroying the building and its contents. However, physicians had the opposite reaction. They rallied to Davidge's support and found another building, collected funds, and secured the necessary legislation to allow dissections to continue. But the story doesn't end there. What is now Davidge Hall, which was built in 1814, conveniently right around the corner from the Westminster Burying Ground. And there are stories of the medical staff procuring cadavers from the newly dug graves for the students to dissect. And this is actually a picture from a dissection class in 1921. And you can see the cadaver here. And conveniently for us, everybody who's in the picture is named. And we were able to sort of trace a lot of them and find out what they did after they left the university. This is another pretty well-known hospital, Church Home and Hospital. It was originally founded as the Washington Medical College in 1835. Dr. Horatio Gates Jameson was the head, along with a number of other physicians at the faculty. Edgar Allan Poe was taken to this location when he was found semi-conscious and ill in a street gutter near East Lombard Street. This is where he subsequently died in October of 1849. And it's suspected that he died of rabies. A lot of people think it's alcoholism, but when you look at the symptoms and everything that he had, it was probably rabies. Dr. Jameson was in a big feud with another member of the faculty, Dr. Frederick E.B. Hintz. Jameson's colleagues were jealous of him and what he had done. And Hintz published a pamphlet disparaging Jameson's surgical skills. So Jameson sued. He was awarded $50, but Hintz assigned away all of his property, so he did not have to pay Jameson. And he just looks like the kind of guy that would do that. The building was purchased in 1857 by the Episcopal Church and renamed Church Home and Infirmary. Patients were required to present a certificate indicating that they were free from mental diseases before they could be treated. The hospital closed in the early 2000s, but the buildings are still there. And this sort of the tower, the pergola right there is still, you can still see it. The buildings are now all used by Hopkins. And this is actually a Saxy drawing of the view from Fairmount, and it's much, much wider than this indicates, but I just wanted to show you this little bit of Church Home. This is the Baltimore College of Dental Surgery, and between 1819 and 1825, Dr. Horace Hayden delivered a series of lectures on dentistry to medical students at the University of Maryland. And in 1839, the dental school was chartered by the Maryland State Legislature as the first dental school in America because of the need for a systematic formal education for the dental profession. Dr. Hayden was a Renaissance man, founding the Maryland Academy of Science and serving as its president. He was a geologist and a botanist and published the first general book on geology in Maryland. And there's actually a mineral that he discovered named after him, and it's called Haydenite. The present dental school evolved through a series of consolidations, the final taking place in 1923. And the dental department of the University of Maryland was combined with the Baltimore School of Dentistry to create a distinct college at the university under state supervision. And this was actually the original building. We think it was at Calvert and Lexington, but there's also a marker right by the Baltimore Arena, the Royal Farms Arena, that says that the dental college was there. So we're not entirely sure where it is, but I think it's just a really attractive building. This is Mount Hope, Retreat for the Insane. In the 1800s, they really didn't pull any punches with the names. There was another mental hospital that was called the Home for Idiots and Imbeciles. So we're not going to talk about that one, though. Mount Hope was a private Catholic institution founded by the Sisters of Charity in 1840. And in 1843, William Stokes became a supervisor of Mount Hope, located just north of Baltimore City. And actually, at that point, it was in just north of Bolton Hill. He held the position for 40 years. Mount Hope was sort of an atypical mental hospital. It was open and bright. It used non-restraint methods of care and a cottage plan for the residents. And they took care of the grounds, and they had gardens, and they took care of the fruit trees that they had. So, it really was sort of not the idea of a mental hospital that you might have. There was an infamous trial against Dr. Stokes and the Sisters of Charity, alleging assault and false imprisonment of several of the residents. And the trial came to an abrupt end when the state said that it was unable to sustain the indictment under the evidence offered. And it was an utter shame and disgrace that Dr. Stokes, who the state had sought to brand as a liar and a conspirator, was really a gentleman whose life had been dedicated to the treatment of diseases of the mind. The current building, which is this, was 4 or 5 stories with a 2-story chapel and built in 1911. And in 1940, it was renamed the Seton Institute, and it closed as that in 1973, and the land was sold to the city as an office park. And there's actually, I think this is an old, a senior residential center. I really couldn't find a lot of information. I know there's a dialysis unit in the bottom, but you can still see vestiges of it, on the property. And that's where the Red Cross is out there, and the NAACP, and a lot of things are in that office park. It's at the end of the very far west end of Northern Parkway. This is the Sheppard Asylum, what you know as Sheppard Pratt. And Moses Sheppard was a wealthy Baltimore merchant and a Quaker. And by 1816, he had amassed a substantial estate. In addition to a store, he had a counting house, a twine manufacturing company, and a tobacco warehouse. And he wanted to improve the conditions for individuals with mental illness and envisioned an institution that would feel more like a home than a prison and treat patients with respect and dignity. At his death in 1857, Sheppard left his fortune to build the Sheppard Asylum, the largest bequest ever made to a mental hospital at that time. Sheppard's vision was shared by Enoch Pratt, a local merchant and philanthropist. He admired what was happening at the Sheppard Institute, and so on his death in 1896, he left a $2 million endowment, and the institution was renamed Sheppard Pratt. The original buildings near Towson were designed by the architect Calvert Bow, and they're actually still quite handsome. They've added a lot to the property, but you can still see, this building is right here. And this is actually a casino that was at the hospital, which, if you think about that, that's probably not the greatest idea, but it used to have a great view out over the north of Charles Street. But Towson University has bought all the land around it, and there are now big dormitories behind it. If anybody wants to see a pretty much intact mid-century modern hospital setting, Sheppard Pratt's Ellicott City campus is a prime example, and I encourage you to drive out there and look at it. It's really quite a building. This is the College of Physicians and Surgeons, which at some point became City Hospital. It was incorporated in 1872 with 43 students. And after a merger with Washington University in 1878, the College of Physicians and Surgeons moved to Calvert and Saratoga streets, which was connected to the Baltimore City Hospital. By 1880, the combined school had an enrollment of 336 students from 23 states, and all were men. The college had total medical control over Mercy Hospital, the Maternity Hospital, Maryland Lying-In Asylum, the Hospital for the Colored Race, the Dispensary, and the Pasteur Department for the treatment of rabies. The College of Physicians and Surgeons also used Bayview Hospital and the Nursery and Child's Hospital, so that the students had numerous opportunities for clinical experiences. And this hospital eventually sort of morphed and changed and is now what is Mercy Medical Center, pretty much at the same location, Calvert and Saratoga streets. And this is John Wesley Chambers, and he was one of the founders of the hospital. And Isaac Trimble was one of the most well-known physicians who was part of the hospital. This is the Southern Homeopathic Medical College and Hospital. It was chartered in 1890. Even though it was founded earlier, it was chartered, they didn't receive their charter until then. And it was the first homeopathic medical college south of the Mason-Dixon line and east of the Mississippi. And homeopathy was founded by Samuel Hahnemann based on the observation of the action of medicines on healthy persons, where it could be seen unmodified by disease. The Southern Homeopathic College occupied a building on Saratoga Street, and in 1902, it moved to a building on Mount Street, adjacent to the Maryland Homeopathic Hospital. The college closed in 1910 and the property was sold to the hospital. But by 1925, that hospital, that facility, had also had closed. And there was a lot of contention about whether homeopathy was really, sort of medical or, what it was. And over the years, there were a lot of problems with real physicians, I guess, having problems with the homeopathic physicians. It was also called the Atlantic Medical College. So in some records like this, it's Atlantic Medical College, Southern Homeopathic Medical College. So sadly, the building doesn't exist anymore. I went by and looked at it. There is a school there now, but it's actually a pretty new school. This is the Hebrew Orphan Asylum. It was organized in 1873 as a safe haven for Jewish immigrants and children. It was originally funded by private contributions from prominent Hebrews in the city of Baltimore. And they really used the term Hebrews instead of Jews at that point. So that's why I'm referring to it as that. In 1874, the building that they were in, which was the Calverton, as we talked about in one of the first slides, Calverton Mansion, was destroyed by fire, and it was rebuilt a year later at a cost of $50,000. And it had a capacity for 150 people. The younger children were taught at the asylum, and the older church went to local public schools. And the boys were taught a trade, and the girls became seamstresses at local stores. The orphanage moved to West Belvedere Avenue, where Sinai Hospital is, once better foster systems came into practice about 1823. These buildings reopened as Baltimore General Hospital and then as Lutheran Hospital until the 1980s, when it closed once again. And our friends at Southway Builders have just completed a renovation of the building, and it really just looks incredible. I should have put in a picture of it a couple of years ago, but I didn't want to depress everybody. And this is Merville Carter, who is the superintendent at the hospital for a number of years. And just sort of a little story as an aside, when I came here and was looking at our portrait collection, I realized somebody had taken all the plaques and plates off all the pictures, and I couldn't identify them. And we had an appraisal by Sotheby's a couple of years earlier, but it didn't have pictures of the portraits, just measurements. So for about 2 years, I went around and tried to match up the people with a catalog number and everything. And I could not figure out who this guy was. And finally, I realized his portrait was square. So I went back through the measurements of the pictures and realized there was one square picture, and that was Merville Carter. So it took me about 3 years to figure that one out. So, and I still have a couple pictures who are unidentified. This is Johns Hopkins. You might have heard of them. It was founded in 1873 by the actual Johns Hopkins, who is an ancestor of our friend Johns Hopkins. It was founded with an endowment of $3 million. And construction began in 1877 with the buildings designed by Nielsen and Nairnsey. It was originally intended to be built at what is now Clifton Park, but a better property closer to downtown was purchased. The first patients were not admitted until 1888. The big four, William Osler, and it's Osler, it's not Osler. So when you hear about Osler Drive on the news, it's really Osler. So the big four, William Osler, William Welsh, William Halstead, and Howard Kelly, who all helped establish the hospital and the medical school, as well as cementing its reputation as one of the top hospitals in the world. And Hopkins was one of the first medical schools to admit women, mainly because one of the original donors, Mary Garrett, required this before she would give Hopkins the funding that they needed. So this is some of the original guys, but they were not very kind to the women who were there at the beginning. And that included Gertrude Stein, who just butted heads with about everybody and actually never really graduated from Hopkins, even though she attended school there. The Baltimore Medical College was founded by a group of Baltimore physicians and advertised itself as a practical Christian medical school. And among the 20 graduates in 1883, there were 4 women. The original offices of the college were at the YMCA building at 93 North Paca Street. And in 1885, Maryland General Hospital was added to the college, as well as a dental department. And these are 2 of the buildings that are still standing at Maryland General. In 1888, Baltimore Medical College obtained a property on Howard Street, just north of Madison, which is, again, where this is, Maryland General. And in 1885, they built a 5-story college at Howard Street in Linden. Again, this is where this is. I'm not sure if it's where these 2 are. I guess it must be, yeah. The new building contained a 600-seat lecture hall, a 500-seat amphitheater, a dispensary, and 4 laboratories. And in 1913, Baltimore Medical College merged with the University of Maryland Medical College, but the ownership of Maryland General Hospital was separate. So 100 years later, in 2013, Maryland General became the University of Maryland Midtown, which is what it is now. And they've just actually built, they're building a new building there, but when they had torn down the buildings, you could actually see this building pretty easily. And that was probably the original. It was called Hamilton Terrace, which was off of Utah Street right there. This is Bon Secours Hospital. In 1881, Sisters of Bon Secours sent 3 members to Baltimore from France at the request of Cardinal Gibbons. Their convent was located at West Baltimore and Payson Street, which is where the hospital is now. By 1907, there were about 20 nuns at the mission, nursing the sick, caring for children, and performing other duties. And by 1919, they had built a 20-bed hospital, and in 1921, they added a nursing school. And all the Bon Secours nuns became nurses, and the order trained its own for many years. Dr. Alexius McGlennon was the superintendent, the president of Bon Secours, and his wife was actually the first woman medical school graduate from Johns Hopkins. Over the years, the hospital has grown continuously. In 1958, a new wing was built. In 1964, an intensive care unit. In 1972, an emergency room, which is, you can't see it, but because I cut the picture off, but the emergency room is right below here. And I had gone out to take pictures of it, and I was like, oh, it's all new. It's all the new building. And I actually drove around the back to what is Lexington Street and looked up and saw this old part of the building, which you can see here and here. It's now part of the LifeBridge group of hospitals. And just a small tip, if you want to get a COVID test really quickly, you can get one there. I had my choice of appointments, had it done at 9 o'clock on Monday morning, and got the results 48 hours later. So you have to go through LifeBridge though. This is the Women's Medical College and the evening dispensary for working women and girls. In an era where women were not admitted to most medical schools, Baltimore had a medical college for women, and so did Philadelphia, actually. The Women's Medical College was founded by 2 of the faculty's members, Randolph Winslow, who you see here, and Dr. Thomas Ashby. They wanted to provide a medical college for women of the highest standards, so all the applicants took a preliminary exam in order to be admitted. There were on-site clinics and labs. The evening dispensary for working women and girls provided outpatient medical care for women. And that was especially important for 2 reasons. Women could mostly not leave work during the daytime to go to a doctor's appointment, and many women disliked having male physicians. So the dispensary provided an opportunity for them and for the female medical students at the Women's Medical College to gain practical experience. In addition to providing free care for women, it also provided a clean milk distribution system for sick babies, a visiting nurse program, and public baths. The women who founded the evening dispensary were mainly graduates of the Women's Medical College, and contemporary accounts note that these early women physicians were friends with a lot of the women who were founding the suffragette movement. And they were also proponents of women riding bicycles, which got a lot of press. And you may have heard of Clarabelle Cone. She's one of the two Cone sisters who had the Cone collection, and Dr. Lillian Welsh, who was a professor at Goucher College. And there was a big sort of a lot of intermingling between Goucher College, the Women's Medical College, and the evening dispensary for the working women and girls. And this is actually the building that they had. It used to be on Utah Street. And I just think it's really quite a stunning building. And you can see here that they have the free dispensary. They're advertising the free dispensary. And I think, got my slides out of order. There were a number of ear, nose, eye and ear, nose and throat hospitals throughout the city. And this, the Presbyterian ear, eye, nose, and throat charity hospital was located at 1017 East Baltimore Street. And this is the building, and it's actually still in existence. It was founded by noted Civil War surgeon and former dean of the University of Maryland School of Medicine, Dr. John Julian Chisholm, who you see here. The Baltimore Charity Eye and Ear, the Eye and Ear Dispensary of Church Home, the Eye and Ear of Baltimore General Dispensary, and also the Baltimore Throat Dispensary all merged in 1882 to become the Baltimore Eye, Ear, and Throat Hospital. In 1961, the Women's Hospital, which was sort of part of this and not part of it, sold all its buildings and equipment to the Baltimore Eye, Ear, and Throat Hospital and acquired 42 acres from Sheppard Pratt for the construction of GBMC. And through a series of moves and mergers, the Presbyterian Eye, Ear, and Throat Hospital ended up at GBMC after a number of years. And recently, the Presbyterian Eye, Ear, and Throat Charity Hospital Board of Governors funded GBMC's Cochlear Implant Center. So it's interesting that the hospital no longer exists, but their board of directors does. And you can see, this is the plaque that's on the building right here. See the plaque right there. But it's still there if you want to go look for it. When I was researching this, one of the most interesting hospitals I came across was the Dispensary for Plaster of Paris Jackets and Free Day School. Sadly, there are no pictures of the building that it was in. But, you know, as contemporary hospitals now are generalists, you know, in the 1880s, hospitals were quite specific, and this is one of them. This was specifically to care for women and children suffering from curvature of the spine and scoliosis. Plaster of Paris jackets were applied and then changed as the spine began to straighten. And Miss Charlotte C. Barnwell, a wealthy spinster, funded the clinic and applied the plaster jackets herself. And these are some contemporary news articles that I found when I was looking up the Plaster of Paris Hospital, and it's kind of interesting just, you know, to see sort of what happened. So there are 80 children. This is the 12th anniversary. They were on Biddle Street, and then they were on Maryland Avenue. Because of the unwieldy jackets, the children could not attend regular school, and the children lived at home but came to the clinic every day. And the mornings were for white children and the afternoons were for Black children. And students were taught Bible instructions, sewing, drawing, singing, and physical exercises, but men were not admitted. And this is there were a number of women's hospitals. And until the latter half of the 19th century, most women gave birth at home, assisted by either a midwife or a maid. And think of Gone with the Wind, you'll know what I'm talking about. And physicians were rarely in attendance. In May of 1887, the Free Lying-In Hospital of the University of Maryland opened under the direction of George W. Miltonberger, who was president of the OBGYN Society. And as an aside, this is actually my favorite painting, and I just think he looks like one of those really nice doctors who says, honey, you want a prescription? I'll write you one, don't worry. When this hospital opened, the only other hospitals for women in Baltimore were the Maryland Women's Hospital, which is shown here. It's actually in Bolton Hill, and it's now dorms for Micah, and the Maternity Lying-In Asylum, both associated with the College of Physicians and Surgeons. And part of the reason that medical schools opened hospitals was so that the students would gain practical experience and not just academic instruction. And in addition to the private maternity hospitals, the St. Vincent's Asylum, which sadly was knocked down a couple of years ago very illegally, the St. Vincent's Asylum also cared for unfortunate women needing reformatory influences. So that sort of started the whole maternity movement. This is the Hospital for Crippled and Deformed Children. And I said they were pretty cold about their names. It was founded in 1895 by Dr. R. Tunstall Taylor as the Hospital for Crippled and Deformed Children, originally on 6 West 20th Street. It was a free orthopedic hospital for crippled children. And as they expanded, they acquired the building next door. And a Mr. James Lawrence Kernan, who was a theater owner, showman, and philanthropist, came to visit the hospital and was so impressed that he purchased the Radnor Park Estate in West Baltimore and deeded it to the hospital. In 1911, after converting the mansion into a working hospital, the name was changed to the James Lawrence Kernan Hospital and Industrial School of Maryland for Crippled Children, Incorporated. And you can see they call it Radnor Park here. It is now a part of the University of Maryland, and it's still an orthopedic and rehabilitation hospital. And it's actually quite pretty. This is the original mansion, and then this was part of the hospital that was added, but it's really very attractive if you can get out there. This is Franklin Square Hospital. This is the original hospital at Calhoun and Fayette Streets. It was an outgrowth of the former National Temperance Hospital of Baltimore. It was a general hospital for both private and free patients. Being a temperance hospital meant that the cases were treated with as little use of alcoholic stimulants as possible. Milton Linthicum and his family is who the area Linthicum is named after, was the chief surgeon at Franklin Square for many years. And this is actually Franklin Square Nursing School. In 1957, Franklin Square purchased a 41-acre site in Baltimore County for a modern hospital. And by 1964, they had moved to Eastern Baltimore County. So, and unfortunately, this building is no longer in existence. This is the Sydenham Hospital for Communicable Diseases, and it was originally constructed near Bayview Asylum out on the east side of Baltimore and opened in 1909. And almost immediately, the 35-bed facility was deemed fatally inadequate for the needs of the city of 600,000. In 1922, the architect Edward Hughes Glidden submitted plans for a 9-building campus near Lake Montebello that could care for up to 140 people. The campus was built in the Italian Renaissance Revival style and opened in 1924. It was equipped to treat more contagious diseases ranging from polio to whooping cough to typhoid, and was in a location that would allow for an expansion. But by 1949, the need for care of contagious diseases had dwindled, but it was still being used to treat tuberculosis patients. In the 1950s, the hospital was renamed and opened as Montebello State Hospital, and nearly $3 million was spent on renovations and additions. Staffing shortages plagued the hospital, and in the 1960s, it closed for good. Many of the buildings were demolished, although several are still being used by Morgan State. And this building and this building are still there, but these are not. And it's really unfortunate because I think it's just one of the most attractive buildings and hospitals that I've seen. And then finally, we have Happy Hills Hospital. And Happy Hills was founded by the 22-year-old Hortense Miller Eliasberg, as a graduate school project for children who had been hospitalized but needed a healthy place to recuperate. And she enlisted Dr. William Welsh from Hopkins as the president of the hospital. And the first location was a farmhouse on Poplar Hill in North Baltimore in Roland Park. They outgrew the space by 1928 and relocated to Rogers Avenue, where they are now. In the 1950s, the name was changed from the Happy Hills Convalescent Home to Mount Washington Pediatric Hospital. And ironically, the earliest children came to Happy Hills because of malnourishment, but now the children come there because of obesity. The Mount Washington Pediatric Hospital is actually the only jointly owned project of the University of Maryland and Johns Hopkins. So thank you so much for taking this tour of Baltimore's historic hospitals with me. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Oh, one thing before we go, here are the resources that I used. The Medical Annals of Maryland from 1799 to 1899, and it was prepared for MedChi's centenary, and it's about 900 pages long. Luckily, it's also digitized and is available through Google Books. Our Maryland medical journals, 1878 to present and 1878 to 1900 are digitized. You can find them. Our archives and art collection dates back to 1799. And if you have any questions, you can see the MedChi archives blog because there's a lot of information there. The Directory of Charitable and Beneficent Organizations of Baltimore is a huge help. Kilduff's Hospitals had pictures of old hospitals. Medicine in Maryland is marylandhistoryonline.net. It has tons of information, and newspapers.com. So those are what I used for my research. So if we have any questions, Nathan?
Yeah, thanks, Meg. I had a lot of questions about if this program would be made available. And we do have a YouTube channel. I shared it in the chat box, but you can also just go to YouTube and search for Baltimore Architecture Foundation and find all of our virtual history series dating all the way back to April there. One question that I have from Jillian is that historically, were there certain architecture firms that specialize in hospital design like we have today?
And the Kirkbrides is one of them. A lot of the mental hospitals, psychiatric hospitals were designed by them, and they had a very specific way of designing. They had wings, and if you look up Kirkbrides, you'll be able to get a lot of information about that. I think that the original buildings at Mount Hope were Kirkbrides, and I think there's a hospital in Western Maryland that's also, but the big psychiatric hospitals that you see are usually Kirkbrides hospitals.
Right, and you mentioned Nairnsey and Nielsen for Hopkins, and they were designing all sorts of different things around Baltimore.
Yeah, and there's actually a book that you can sometimes find on eBay about hospital architecture. It's an early 1900s book, and it's got plans and elevations for a lot of hospitals around the country, including Hopkins.
I'm trying to see if we have more questions. We have lots of comments from people who were either born in some of these hospitals or worked in hospital administration. They're familiar with them, which is really interesting to see. One other question we have is there any information on Provident Hospital and the Helen Fold School of Nursing?
I don't know because I really didn't look it up. I really had to call the list, just hacked it to pieces just to get it down to the 20 that I ended up having, the 25. So I don't know, but I think, just look online and you might be able to find something.
Another question relating to Nairnsey is that Nairnsey first designed the administration building on Broadway to have a central garden in the rear that was lined with a small common ward building. Do you know if that was done? And Jillian posted a photo for reference in the chat.
Oh, okay. I don't know. I know there was an octagonal shaped building there, but I don't know. I've actually seen the original plans of it. It was in that book that I just referred to, but I just don't remember off the top of my head.
And one last question for you is, do you know anything about the Springfield Hospital Center in Sykesville, and was it affiliated with any hospitals in Baltimore?
No, I know it was a state mental hospital. So, and a lot of physicians sort of were up there and back here. They went up to Springfield and they came back. I think they're very attractive buildings, and Spring Grove actually in Catonsville. Again, those are just really amazing old buildings. They're huge stone buildings and just really, really incredible.
Great. Well, thank you, Meg. It's always a pleasure to have you join us for one of these.
Thank you.
And we'll see everybody hopefully next week. Next week is our 30th presentation. So it's a big milestone for us.
Well, great. Thanks a lot. And everybody have a great weekend.